just so you know, I'm a dermatologist. I don't play one on TV, but I sure am not anything else. I've read some books, but I'm not an expert in statuary, history, politics, law, or neo-Confederate ideology. Be gentle. And I am not a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, but my mother was. And she's probably spinning in her urn when she hears what I'm going to say. So here we are at Monumental Decisions, the Origins and Messages of Confederate Memorials. I started looking at this because of CNN and everything that's been going on with the statues being toppled, their beleaguered statues. They're demonstrating against the Confederate statues. This particular one, I really like the picture of Lee in Richmond with all the graffiti, and then the projection of Harriet Tubman with the BLM letters on the old traveler there. And these demonstrations, the first thing to start out with is who's demonstrating? Well, Black Lives Matter protesters, that's a simple answer, and they found these offensive enough to deface and or topple. And what's so offensive? Well, you say, well, the Confederates fought to keep slaves, so that's bad, and they didn't believe Black Lives Matter. So that's probably enough, but not really. And so what I'm going to do is talk about who put them up, why they were put up, what they meant, and what life was like at the time all this was going on. So you get an idea of what was going on in the community, what was happening to other people, because my main interest in the whole situation is to see why there's this confabulation of Southern and white going together. And that's what a lot of people think, especially I think if they're carrying the rebel flag. And it's not that, as we know. There are real and valid experiences, especially among Black people, and stories that go back way, way back in families of things that happen, things that are not common memories to white people, neither are but in experiences with white people certainly are experienced by Black people in some somewhat unpleasant ways. So I've had to learn quite a lot about Civil War and certainly Reconstruction history, and I will share it with you, like I say, before I tip my head and it all falls out, because I just learned it recently. I'm no historian. So we'll talk about it, and I will encourage discussion afterwards. Memorials and monuments are very, very interesting. I like this quote that a meaning is never set in stone, even though the monument may be. The people who commission it may have one message in mind, but those who view the monument and generations follow, they draw entirely different lessons. Look at these two statues. This is the Jeb Stuart Monument. It was there from 1907 to this year when it was taken away from Monument Avenue in Richmond. The one to the right is Rumors of War by Kehinde Wiley, a Black artist who, the one who painted Obama's portrait for the White House. This was commissioned by the Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond and put up in 2019. Someone who was not American, or maybe say someone from China that came and looked at both of these would say, well, they're the same essentially. They're just different people on the same horse. And that's why the horse on the right was in that pose, because there are parallels to be drawn. But I think we can look at this and say, this guy is a typical young braided haired protester or something. We know he's an action figure, that's for sure. And it says a lot of things and inspires, I can think of lots of conversations to have about that statue. So here are two different examples of things that almost look the same, but are in fact extremely different. The Southern Poverty Law Center has a website, and on that website is this graph, and I'll be discussing parts of it. We'll see it again. This is not the last time. But this is a timeline starting from 1861. Here at the lower left corner is the Civil War, then Reconstruction along that light gray line, and then we come up to about to 1900 here in the middle, and then you have World War I, then the Great Depression, World War II, and then the Civil Rights Movement. So this is what we're looking at. The orange dots are monuments and in other sites, and monuments on courthouse grounds are in blue. The other places that monuments could be are, of course, our cemeteries. This does not include battlefields. But what you need to know is that there have been 1,700 monuments, Confederate monuments, put up all over the place. And the Southern Poverty Law Center makes the case that whenever there is some kind of an action like Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal, segregation, the monuments get built higher up because they are symbols of white supremacy, and this is kind of what they do. I would mention that I think it's important to look at the dates and say, well, in 1861 to 65, let's look at 1911 to 1915, the 50-year anniversary of the Civil War, when monuments were going up to memorialize that event, as they did in 1961 to 65 was the 100-year anniversary. So you have to be sure that you're not overreading things into these, but certainly there are some very significant dates in here, and we'll go over those when we discuss each category. We need to talk about, let's talk about the Daughters of the Confederacy. And the reason we need to do that is look at the first thing that the daughters do. They build monuments. Doggone it. They've been doing it here in 1920. They were founded in 1894, and they pretty much started building monuments soon thereafter. This is their big monument in Arlington. And this is what they look like then. This is an anonymous group that's on the website. I bet they're officers, though. They look like officers with their sashes. And they have several other things that they do. But I wanted to mention the monuments because when they said, where'd the monuments come from? I said, well, I know where they came from. My mother was a daughter of the Confederacy. We didn't build a lot of Confederate monuments in New Mexico, but they certainly did if you were in Georgia or in Virginia. So this group is one of the major players in what I'll be talking about today. Another group, the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, are also players. They're even more players lately because they have taken it upon themselves to be the guardians of the monuments. So when somebody wants to take one down, there's probably going to be a suit for the Confederate veterans. But they are a far more fun-loving group, I think, looking at this gang here. They've got, here's their pen, and they've got their motorcycles. For heaven's sake, they call themselves the Mechanized Cavalry. They've got their big flags out. Here they are at the Silent Sam monument at Duke, where they are demonstrating or having a rally. It's a rally. And they almost got $2.5 million to take care of that monument after it's removed. However, that was overthrown. They're pretty happy that day. I bet they knew about the $2 million then, but it's gone now. So more going on. It's a big crowd, and I don't know that everybody is familiar with some of the more sordid aspects of our history anytime, but this is the United States in 1861. You see in green the Confederate states, the states that seceded. In pink and up to the north is the North, the U.S. of A. The tasteful ochre, brown, gold brown are the territories. Just there won't be a quiz on this, but just to give you an idea of who's playing, and you see that Georgia's right in the middle of it. So we were certainly playing at that time. Yeah, so southern plantations versus northern cities. Southern plantations, here we see the slaves planting the cotton, picking the cotton, processing the cotton, packing it up. King cotton in the South. Their economy depended on cotton, growing cotton and having free labor to take care of it. In the North, industry and commerce. This is New York City about the same time, and they were very, very different, as you could see. So there's industry and an agrarian economy. Let's just get some definitions first, and let me just toss this. And I'm going to be throwing in a lot of things that they come back to the center. Prejudice is a hostile or negative attitude towards members of a specific group. It's easy to think that the New Yorkers would have perhaps some prejudice about the planters and vice versa. Discrimination is unequal treatment of members of a specific group. It's not hard to imagine discrimination, class discrimination between perhaps a captain of industry and his clerks or the people in his household. Certainly the owner of the plantation and the shopkeepers, they might have a different kind of relationship. So there could be discrimination, unequal treatment of members of that group. Racism, though, is different in that it's an ideology based on a concept that racial groups form a biogenetic hierarchy. That is, that there are different races of people and that some are better than others. And this is what they studied. This is what they believed. They had proof, science, huh? So let's look at what they were talking about in the American School of Anthropology. Samuel George Morton collected human skulls all over the world. Interesting, he had the idea and used this, that if you turned a skull upside down and filled it with shot or seeds or beans or something, you had a way to measure the capacity. You could weigh that and compare it to different other skulls, when he had the idea that large skulls equal large brain and high intellectual capacity. In 1839, he published Crania Americana and stated that Caucasians had the biggest brains, then Native Americans, and that Negroes have the smallest brains. Notice he's already said that that was intellectual capacity. This particular picture comes from the illustration of Indigenous Races of the Earth, 1857. We're getting closer and closer to our timeline. And here we have the Greek statue, the Apollo Belvedere, which is considered an ideal. It has nothing to do with where his skull is, by the way. It's just the angle that's bad. And so he's the best. He's the Greek statue. Here we have the Negro skull and the chimpanzee skull, and that Negroes are a creational rank between Greeks and chimpanzees. This was the kind of science they were doing, and there you go. That's what people thought. Scientific racism was codifying this into some kind of an idea that this was scientific. Here you see the 5 races of man at the time. They had many more. Whoever had the most pictures got to have the most races. But I think you get a pretty good idea of who's there as the ideal in the center. This was starting to look at Anglo-Saxon, white, and look at that, no pigment in the skin. That's not a loss in the eyes of these people. This really kept going into the 1800s to justify white European imperialism and was thought to be true until the end of World War II. So this was the environment that everyone was dealing with. They didn't think a whole lot of the slaves, as you can imagine. So let's have some entertainment. Let's talk about what's the most popular entertainment at the time, and that happened to be minstrel shows, the uniquely American style of entertainment. And this was truly something from 1840 to the 1890s. This was the greatest stuff ever, and it was funny. It was there was song, dance, but the odd thing about it is that it was white performers wearing blackface, pretending to be darkies, which darkies was code for slaves. They spoke in black dialect. This is a white man in blackface. He is playing the character Jim Crow, who was an actual slave who was crippled and had a funny way of dancing, which of course in those days, because there was zero political correctness, meant that he was an object of laughter, as were people who stuttered or spoke strangely. So black dialect was hilarious for everyone. Stereotyped characters were either carefree ne'er-do-wells on southern plantations or ignorant buffoons in northern cities. And this was great stuff. Slapstick singing, dancing, and skits. Later, this evolved into burlesque and vaudeville. So this form of entertainment really had a lot to do with the way we started doing variety shows. Look over on the right, and there are some songs. Look at that. Look at those songs. Now, there's one in red, Dixie. Dixie came from the minstrel shows, but Stephen Foster wrote for the minstrel shows, and all of these were made popular in minstrel shows. I bet you I sang a lot of these songs in Girl Scout camp, at church camp. How about you? I bet a lot of us know those songs, and given a big enough crowd, we could probably come up with the words to every one of them. I don't know Masses in the Cold, Cold Ground, but the other ones I sure know Camptown Races. So this was what people were doing for fun, for entertainment, and just to give you an idea, we're going to talk about white people and black people. We have white people pretending to be black people to entertain each other. Abolitionism was around. There were 4 million slaves in the United States at that time. It was a group that wanted to end slavery. It was based in the North, of course, and totally illegal in the South. You couldn't even mail magazines to the South about abolition. The Southern leaders didn't like the Republicans blocking the expansion of slavery into the West. They said it challenged their autonomy. And the last straw was when Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. The Deep South states decided to secede and form a new nation. Now, they seceded because they wanted to expand slavery into the West. There were a lot of reasons, but slavery was pretty important because that meant that they couldn't continue moving and doing what they were, moving into new territory and doing what they were doing. You can't talk about abolitionism without mentioning Frederick Douglass, and this is just a little punch for his new book. As the president says, we're hearing a lot about Frederick Douglass. He's doing good things these days. He's been doing good things for a long time. But this particular book has won the Pulitzer Prize. It was written by David Blight, who's an historian that wrote one of the books I used for this, and I was impressed. So we know about the slave, the fugitive, and the campaigner for abolition, but he was very interested in the last 30 years of his life when he was the radical outsider becoming the political insider. And this makes you think a little bit about John Lewis. And I think this should be a very interesting and good book to put on your list to read. Okay, here's the Civil War. This is all you're going to hear of the Civil War from me. We're not going into skirmishes, battles, anything else, but know that it started in 1861, it ended in 1865. But we are going to talk about one thing that happened during the Civil War, and that was that Lincoln freed the slaves. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st of 1863, and after that date, just like the 4th of July, Emancipation Day was a big deal for freedmen. They were no longer slaves, and let's have a party. Here's an Emancipation Day parade, the picture in Richmond, Virginia in 1905. There were different dates celebrated by different people. January 1st was the proclamation itself. February 9th, the 13th Amendment was signed. December 6th, it was ratified. April's 9th, you could celebrate then, but you want to do that pretty much out of sight of anybody white, because that's when the Confederate Army surrendered into Appomattox, and they might get the wrong idea about what you're celebrating. Juneteenth is a date, June 19th, 1865, 2 years after Emancipation, when the U.S. Army came to Texas and announced that the Civil War was over, because it hadn't been known until then that it was. So Juneteenth is a big holiday in Texas and in some other places where you can celebrate. So Emancipation Day, that was a wonderful thing. Of the 4 million slaves, there were some Black men that immediately went up to the North and joined the Union Army. Free African Americans from the North and runaway slaves had been in the South before. After Emancipation, there were definitely more. There were a total of 206,000 Black soldiers and sailors, which was quite a lot when you think about it. 16 African Americans received the Medal of Honor. They fought bravely, and it was thought by the Confederates that they would not fight bravely, that they in fact didn't even want to give them arms, and probably with good justification. So there really were no Black Confederate troops, although you might hear from others. It's not an opinion, it's the truth, but you can hear anything on the internet. So Black troops were less likely to be taken prisoners, because Confederates killed many prisoners, treated them badly, or sent them back to slavery. So they were usually killed. They fought to the death rather than to be taken, because it wasn't good for them. This statue that I'm showing you here is from the African American Civil War Memorial that was put up in 1998. It has lovely representations of the soldiers, but these, around the bottom of it, it has these sweeping concentric circles, and those have the names of the soldiers. Monuments have changed with time, and ever since Marilynne did the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, with everyone's name, that's thought to be really much more important at recognizing people than just an anonymous statue somewhere. So the Shaw Memorial in Boston is considered by some to be America's greatest public monument. It really is a lovely thing. It was put up late because it took him a long time to make it. He actually got Black men to sit for these are definitely their portraits. They are immortalized on this bas-relief. The 54th Regiment was a second all-Black Union regiment led by Colonel Robert Shaw of Boston. He was the son of abolitionists, and he put together this company. 25% of the troops came from slave states, and 2 were Frederick Douglass's sons. If you saw the movie Glory in 1989, so long ago, it doesn't seem like that long, that was the story of this regiment, and it won some Academy Awards. So that's the Shaw Memorial. Notice, we're not going to see much in the way of memorialization of Black anything in statuary in the South. Now we get to the Confederate icons, and this is one of the most iconic pictures of the Confederacy. This is the burial of Latane, who was a young soldier who died in a skirmish in the South. I think he was the only one that fell in a battle that Jeb Stuart was in charge of. His friend brought him to the nearest plantation, and he was buried there by the women and the faithful slaves. So this shows, of course, there are no men present because they've all gone off to fight. They're soldiers. The faithful slaves have dug the grave, and they've fashioned a casket. The mourners are the women of the house, and the mistress of the house is having to read the prayer of the grave. This is a heartbreaking picture and shows again the lovely values of the chaste and noble women, the faithful slaves, and the fallen soldier. It's a heartbreaker, and it was published so that there was a rotogravure or an etching of it so that everybody could have it in their house, and they did. Post-war devastation. It is without a doubt devastation. This picture of Richmond in April 1865 is evocative of 9/11 to me. It really was astounding. As Henry Grady said, most of the time a Confederate soldier came home to his house in ruins, his farm devastated, his slaves free, his stock killed, his barns empty, his trade destroyed, his money worthless, and his social system, futile in its magnificence, swept away. The federal government, its support could be called lackluster at best, of Black civil rights and security following the Civil War was a failure, and that caused much trouble to come. You'll hear more. Stay tuned. This picture is of a Confederate battlefield, burial ground, and this is what they looked like. They were pretty rough and ready. In 1865, there were thousands of shallow and/or mass graves on Southern battlefields. Union officers came down and collected the Union dead and didn't do anything about the Confederates, which offended the ladies who had had ladies' aid societies and had been wrapping bandages and taking care of things at home. They formed memorial associations and set out to recover remains and establish cemeteries. They did not dig up remains, but they hired people to do it. They raised money for cemetery workers, headstones, and walls. Throughout the South, they buried more than 260,000 Confederate war dead themselves in Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, North and South Carolina. They were the community forerunners of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Each one of these organizations, there might have been more than one, several organizations in a town as large as Richmond. Smaller towns would have only one Ladies Memorial Association, but they worked just for their communities. But when there came a chance to unite the Daughters of the Confederacy, they were there ready to go. This is when we start really getting serious about the lost cause ideology. The lost cause is that they were not the winners, but they were noble in their vanquishing. And in order not to be complete losers, they started working on an ideology, a mythology, if you will, that states' rights, usually the right to secede, but not slavery, was the cause of the, as they called it, the war between the states. That's what I learned, that it was the war between the states, not the Civil War. Slaves, I don't know if you realize this, were content and happy and not mistreated in slavery. In fact, they benefited from slavery. They were fed, they were cared for, they were able to become good Christians. This was a winner all the way around, and slaves were expensive. Why would you beat a slave or injure one when they would talk and they would tell the neighboring plantation that massa has beaten them? That would make you look very bad to the neighbors. So that's why that slaves were so happy and content. Was that true? Well, probably not. I mean, when you go to bed and you don't know if you're going to be sold down the river the next day, that doesn't make for, you know, happy sleep. Confederate soldiers were one of the other points. They were heroic, mythical figures to be revered for defending the South and its way of life. And we all know that the Southern women were chaste and noble. So, though never named as its goal, white supremacy underpins the entire lost cause ideology. And we'll hear more. Reconstruction. Reconstruction lasted from 1865 to 1877, but it was complicated. Whoa, it took me a couple of weeks to really get a feel for what all went on there and find pictures for you. During this time, the federal government was trying to, after they freed the slaves, they needed to protect the rights of the slaves. They couldn't just turn them loose because they'd been on plantations all the time. They didn't read, they didn't do a whole lot. I found Sherman's Field Order number 15 to be very interesting. He wrote down, he didn't send it anywhere, this wasn't official, but he wrote down that although he had just laid waste to a swath from Atlanta to Savannah, that he wanted to reserve coastal land in Georgia and South Carolina for black settlement. This would have been the Low Country, including the Sea Islands, and it's where rice was grown. And this was a source of some aggravation to the Union Army, and so on. So that needed to be clarified. This particular area has been brought up sometimes when talk is given of restitution, of yes, we were promised this land and we never got it. The Freedmen's Bureau was a good idea, 1865 to 1872. It was to lease 40-acre parcels for economic self-sufficiency for families. This was the 40 acres and a mule, food, jobs, legal assistance, and schools, but was obscenely underfunded, say basically not. But 500 schools were built, staffed, and run by freedmen. The slaves wanted to learn to read. They wanted to learn things. They wanted to be self-sufficient. Alas, it wasn't going to work out. President Andrew Johnson was a piece of work, unbelievable. 1865, he says to Congress, the war is over, the South is repentant. Voting and civil rights issues are matters for the states. Sort of like ventilators, huh? We've heard that. Not my business. No, nope, not my responsibility. So in 1866, he initially promised to punish the traitors, but he issued 7,000 pardons to people who had seceded, to those who had seceded. In 1867, he declares that Black Americans have less capacity for government than any other race of people. There's race again. He rescinded orders granting Black farmers tracts of land that had been confiscated from Confederates, and confiscated not from active Confederates. This was land that had been abandoned and was pretty useless thanks to Sherman, but he took it back, and he advocated sharecropping that soon replaced slavery as a primary source of Southern agricultural labor. Sharecropping was a tough way to go because you had to give half your crops to the owner of the land, and you had to buy seed and buy supplies from them too, with loans or whatever you could get, if you could get a loan. In 1872, the Amnesty Act, this I just was astounded. It was amended to allow almost all former Confederates, except for some of the very high-ranking officials, to hold public office and vote. So the Confederates were essentially pardoned. Amazing, amazing. So the Black Codes were for the protection of the slaves. You couldn't just let slaves loose, no telling what they'd do. So from 1866 to 1868, they imposed restrictions on the activities of freedmen, such as owning property or operating businesses. They couldn't do those things. If they weren't employed, they were arrested as vagrants and punished with forced labor. Gee, that sounds a lot like slavery. To avoid being arrested as vagrants, they had year-long contracts with plantations when you couldn't break the contract. You had only a few days each year before you signed on for another year. White Republicans were called carpetbaggers and scalawags, and the Black institutions like schools and churches, anything that was a symbol of Black autonomy, were targets for attacks by the Klan and the White League. So the KKK came in 1866. It lasted till 1871, probably 1870, 71, when it was pretty much drummed out it was very bad. Here's a picture. It says this is a white man's government. Here's another example of black codes in Mississippi. Each state had its own. Stopping the newly freed from being a burden on society. We already know about the labor contracts. Know that they could only work as a laborer or domestic. They couldn't work independently. They couldn't be self-sufficient. Even if they'd been a blacksmith or a cook or some other skill they developed while enslaved, they'd be a free agent and be hired for that. They were banned from hunting and fishing in Mississippi, so they couldn't feed themselves if they were on their own. They couldn't buy liquor or carry arms. Punishment was being hired out for no pay, essentially being enslaved. And the penalty for defiance or inappropriate behavior was whipping. So the black codes were slavery in all but name. The Republicans in Congress, excuse me, were, they were shocked by this. They were just appalled. They said, this wasn't the way it was supposed to be. We're going to help you out. And so they did. They insisted on civil and political rights for African Americans. That was good in the face of fierce resistance by the whites, the Klan and the rest. Bad. Well, that was a bit of an impasse. So the federal military occupation of the defeated Confederacy ensured that this was going to work. Well, you can imagine how well that did work, not as well as you would have liked. This was the good part of Reconstruction. 150,000 black men registered to vote. They had the vote. 700 served in elected public office. 2 senators, 14 members of the House of Representatives. Others held appointed government jobs. This was what they thought it was going to be like now that they were free. They were wrong. Many of these people who were representatives and elected people were later lynched and had bad things happen, as though that's not bad enough. So the end of Reconstruction was in 1877 when there was a compromise. The compromise was that federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. You would no longer have this fellow standing between the white landowner and the black freedman. There would be no more attempt to guarantee civic and political equality, and the U.S. agreed to the South's demand that the whole problem be left to them. Don't ask, don't tell. 1896, the Supreme Court upheld segregation laws, and across the South, lynching, disenfranchisement, and segregationist laws proliferated. This was the bad times. White supremacy, in just this definition, is a belief system. And this was it. White people are genetically superior to other people. Whites should have dominance over people of other backgrounds, especially where they may be coexisting in the same time and place. And that white people have their own culture that is superior to other cultures. White supremacy is much more encompassing than just simple racism or bigotry. It is this hierarchy and something that you simply cannot get away from. It is baked in. Meanwhile, back with the ladies, Confederate Memorial Days would happen. And since they had military there watching them all the time, the men couldn't do much by way of glorifying the Confederacy or talking about what their ideals were in that regard. But the ladies could certainly every year march to the graves. They could have speakers that extolled white or Anglo-Saxon supremacy. The Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Army, was jealous. In 1868, they said, well, traitors in the South have their gatherings to strew garlands of flowers, then we should have that too. Well, did they share? No, no. The Confederate Memorial Day is still observed in some southern states. Georgia had Confederate Memorial Day up until pretty recently. Now it's called state holiday, perhaps not as attractive or reminiscent of any events, but there it is. So Confederate Memorial Days let people keep talking, keep working, and then strewing flowers on graves. Hundreds and even thousands of citizens, they would march to the cemetery. Be nice if you marched to the cemetery from a monument in the center of town, and then that lets you then go to the cemetery. And so monuments were a big deal. Here's the Confederate monument boom was driven almost entirely by organized womanhood, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy were there for that. First of all, you had to raise money. Over to the right are all the things you could do, and there were probably more: bake sales, auctions, lectures, barbecues, musical shows, fiddling contests, benefit suppers. Build enthusiasm in your club and contact the monument companies for prices and ideas on how you can raise more money. The monument companies were the drivers of a whole lot of things that were going on. They would tell you who had. So this month, the magazine would come out. It would say, last month we had 35 monuments going up. Now we have 50. And here are the towns who have bought a monument. And this one is going to be on its way. It's going to be up. You better start getting your money together quick so you won't get left behind. So it raised a little healthy competition between little towns. So monuments were a civic duty and a point of pride. Typical Civil War monuments were mostly a guy on a pedestal. Sculpted bronzes were expensive and heavy. This is one actually of a person. This guy is a model, not a person per se that was recognizable. He could be recast and sold to other venues, but mostly Civil War monuments were the Silent Sentinel. The Silent Sentinel is a soldier standing at parade rest, a foot soldier, and he's got holding his gun by the barrel, and popular in both South and North, and could be sized to specification. You order your soldier, and you then order the pedestal. They could be ordered by mail. How convenient. Well, you want to be sure that you're paying attention when you get your statue, because here the Monumental Bronze Company that operated out of Connecticut, this sculpture of a Union soldier here on the left was erected in New Jersey, 1889. And gosh, he looks just like the Confederate soldier in Windsor, North Carolina, that had been erected in 1898. And in fact, he was indeed exactly the same soldier. They would change the belt buckles, put USA and CSA on them, but you really had to do better than that. If you wanted a Johnny Reb, you sure didn't want to put up a Billy Yank. There'd be problems. So the Johnny Reb statues later on wore slouch hats rather than that build cap that the Confederates indeed did wear, but for statues, they wear the slouch hat. They wore short shell jackets, and they carried bedrolls across their chests. So you see a statue, now you know who he is. It's either Johnny or Billy, and woe betide the one that gets it wrong. So if you were just a little community and you were ordering your statue, you might not get the benefit of experience, and you might want to put it in the cemetery. Seems reasonable. You might want to put it in the train station, but the United Daughters of the Confederacy will show you the way. Cemetery, too far removed from daily public contact. The train station, we don't build monuments for strangers. We build monuments for our children. The town square, that's where you get your moral influence. That's the place you want to put your statue. They also will be reading and writing Confederate history, researching and writing. I'm not sure how much research went in, but they certainly wrote Confederate history, and they established some educational endowments. As time went on, we didn't have to benevolently care of veterans so much. They founded in 1894. By 1900, 6 years later, there were 412 chapters. If you wonder about marketing, these gals knew what they were doing. Here's a bit of lost cause rhetoric for you, just so you get a feel for it. So you say they've got these soldiers out there, and these soldiers are war memorials, right? Well, the soldiers emphasize the South's devotion and character, not the actual political or economic aims of the Confederacy. You don't put up a monument with a slave and a bale of cotton. You want a soldier, devotion and character. In this remaking of history, the North is a new kind of enemy, because the Union won simply because of its overwhelming numbers and economic superiority. So the Northern troops were just characterless human machines, unlike our rebels, who are not, and we are not, ourselves supporters or descendants of slaveholders, or as believers in state rights. These are men of spotless character, confronting a modern world that often seemed chaotic and without integrity. That's lost cause rhetoric. A world chaotic and without integrity, but they're there for you. So let's move on and talk about lynching, because that certainly comes up right about now. Between 1877 and 1950, there were more than 4,075 documented lynchings of African Americans, concentrated in 12 southern states. Vigilantes whipped and lynched black freedmen. White terror groups would target black men for perceived sexual transgressions against white women. Remember, white women are chaste and noble. This caused a lot of trouble, and it didn't, all you had to do was have a shop, be economically successful. That was enough. And sadly enough, the NAACP in New York City resorted to this flag, and they had pulled it out once or twice a week sometimes. A man was lynched yesterday. That was the protest flag at the headquarters in New York City. This was a real problem. Here are African American lynching victims by state, 1877 to 1950. This was what was going on, unfortunately. Ida B. Wells was an investigative reporter. She was a dynamite stick. She was an activist. She led an anti-lynching crusade in the 1890s, almost got lynched herself. They burned her news office, but there she is. And look down here, February 2020. This year, lynching was declared a hate crime. It was the Emmett Till anti-lynching law. It finally passed after 200 bills had been proposed since 1900. How's Georgia doing here? Well, are we in competition? 589 lynchings. Mississippi's got more, 654, but Louisiana and Arkansas are kind of neck and neck. It was so common. It's really quite shocking. The Memorial for Peace and Justice, also known as the Lynching Memorial, is in Montgomery, Alabama, and it is, for everything I have seen and read of it, which you can see and read online, until that day we can all get out and go somewhere. It is really, really beautiful and is well done, and has been modeled after the Holocaust museums in other places, and which it is. It's the Southern Holocaust. So this was something that has to be mentioned, because this is in family memory. This is something that Black families, Black churches, Black organizations know well and are very, very aware. You can't pretend anything when this kind of pretend any kind of sympathy when this sort of thing was going on. The Emancipation Memorial was put up in 1876. Took it a while to get up there. It was the Emancipation or Freedmen's Memorial. It was paid for by former slaves, primarily African American Union Army veterans, although they had no say whatsoever in what the statue looked like. Many of these statues don't have anybody's input, but the ones that want to say something about it. The kneeling slave perpetuated the myth that emancipation was a gift from white Americans. It was an abolitionist motif, and here it is on the statue. It's labeled Emancipation, and Lincoln is holding presumably the act that he signed. Frederick Douglass dedicated the statue, but afterward complained he didn't like that the black man was naked and on his knees. And actually, after going home and thinking about it for a few days, he did some more writing about it and said, this is really inappropriate. And in fact, the statue is quite controversial, and there's discussion of replacing it in favor of monuments honoring black abolitionists. Or something else, who knows? We need to talk about these things. You're going to put something up. Let's get some buy-in from all the Southerners if you're going to put up a Southern monument. Look, here's one you've seen before, the Statue of Liberty. What's she doing here? Well, she was a gift from France to celebrate the end of slavery. Who knew? Look, she has, you can't see because of this big, tall pedestal, but she has shackles, she has chains that are broken. Astounding. Unfortunately, by the time she was completed in 1886, Reconstruction had been crushed, the Supreme Court had rolled back civil rights protections, and Jim Crow laws were tightening. Black newspapers railed against the statue as meaningless and hypocritical. There were a lot of black newspapers, and they were voluble. You knew what they were thinking. In 1903, they added the Emma Lazarus poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free," and Lady Liberty became a beacon for immigration. So she started out being a slave memorial. Interesting. Oh, let's have some entertainment. Take a break. Let's have some popular literature. What are people reading 1880 to 1905 and around then, turn of the century? Well, Joel Chandler Harris, a white newspaperman from the Atlanta Constitution, was writing the Uncle Remus series. Thomas Nelson Page wrote the Mars Chan series. This was a big deal. Well, it was very popular anyway. Mars Chan was the younger son of a plantation family. His name was Tom Channing, but they, of course, all called him, well, perhaps not the family, not anybody except the slaves, called him Mars Chan. And Sam was the slave who was only a few years older than Mars Chan that took care of him and grew up with him. And when Mars Chan went off to the Civil War as a Confederate soldier, Sam went with him to help him out. He was not a soldier, he was just there as a bodyman for Mars Chan. And of course, Mark Twain, we all know Huckleberry Finn. These three in red are all dialect books. They're all books sort of like white men putting on blackface. This time they are putting on black voices, and not always the same character, but different ones. And they were extremely popular. Also in 1899, Charles W. Chestnut, who lived as a black man, he was 7/8 white, wrote some interesting books and stories about that usually involved in some way passing the color line, and stories of romance and other things. Not actually getting into miscegenation, but certainly those topics were brought up. Kate Chopin wrote The Feminist Awakening in the same year. We get down to 1905, and Thomas Dixon Jr., The Klansman. Oh my goodness, look at that. That's a popular one. That's going to sell well. You just know it is. Here's Uncle Remus. Here's one of the original tracts that were put out by him. And if you're old enough, you might remember Uncle Remus, Disney's Uncle Remus. And I assure you, you're not going to see this on Disney Plus anytime soon. In fact, you'd be lucky to find a bootleg version of it anywhere if you want to sing Zippity Doo-Dah with the 1946 Song of the South. Again, using the black character, using dialect, all of these things, as you'd think that everybody was getting along just great, but no, not exactly. Now, the UDC is coming back, and that is in The Cult of the Lost Cause with Margaret Lewis Rutherford, who was another piece of work. Historian General of the United Daughters of the Confederacy for a couple of decades. She reigned as the UDC's most articulate interpreter of the South's lost cause. Here she is in Plantation Ware, performing. She went all over the South, was invited to tell stories of plantation days and the massa and the missus caring for the loyal slaves. As Historian General, she was also in charge of making sure that the UDC approved textbooks for children that published true history. And if it wasn't true history, that is the lost cause, that book would be banned because it was not what they would like for children to learn. It was taught in school books, textbooks, until the 1960s, the lost cause, which is where some of the neo-Confederates get their information about the Confederacy and why slavery wasn't all that bad, and a lot of other things. Be careful who you lie to, because it can come back and bite you. The magazine of the Lost Cause was the Confederate Veteran. It had a big circulation. Different societies would send articles for it. It upheld the cult of the Lost Cause. And monument companies were big advertisers, not surprisingly. So this was really quite a little industrial complex they had going. There's no surprise that there are that many monuments everywhere, and that school books were changed or were set right. Reconciliation was also interesting. You think, oh, well, that's reconciliation between the white farmers and the slaves. Well, gee, no, it was for the Confederates and the Union and the Confederates. You can tell which one's a Confederate. There's his hat, here's the loose cap. This is the Union, here's the Confederate. In 1898, they went to war against Spain, and we needed some soldiers, and we had them. Boy, there were soldiers everywhere. So white Americans got together, and the Spanish-American War went well. Everyone was very pleased with it. Great sentiment for getting the boys back together, and people would flutter when they'd see at a reunion to see the Union and the Confederate boys shaking hands across the wall at Gettysburg. Very sentimental. They were so sentimental that the government agreed to help with maintenance of Civil War cemeteries, including those of the former Confederacy. So they decided they would bury some Confederates in Arlington. Now, there were no new Confederates to bury, but there were a lot of Confederates that were in cemeteries in that area. And they set aside Section 16 because that was part of the estate of Robert E. Lee. Good enough for him, I guess. So they moved the remains, and the UDC asked for a memorial, and here it is. This is a giant memorial. These are life-size figures all around the edges. And here's a close-up of some of them. If you go to the website of Arlington National Cemetery, it calls this monument a nostalgic, mythologized vision of the Confederacy, including highly sanitized depictions of slavery. It has the pillars of lost cause ideology, Confederate military service, white Southern family life, and the faithful slave. Here is the faithful Negro body servant following his young master. This was the actual description in 1915 that when the monument was put up. And here's the soldier, and here is his body servant. And here is an officer kissing his child in the arms of an old Negro mammy. She doesn't look that much like an old Negro mammy, but he's taking care of the kids, and there it is. This was very sentimental, very sentimental. The United Daughters loved this image of the mammy. The Sons of the Confederacy saw the image of the Negro body servant and said, oh, this is proof that there were black men in the Confederate Army. So everybody takes their own description. Here's another statue. This one is to Booker T. Washington, and it's a nice one. The United Daughters did not put this one up. but it's a beauty. Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute and put himself through school and college and was an influential, if conciliatory, leader for Black America. He is showing this freed slave a better future through education. And I think it's a very nice monument. That in Tuskegee, there is, of course, also a Confederate monument put up by the daughters. It is even now in the process of being relocated. Well, the UDC was full of itself over the Arlington statue. And so they said, they went a little bit too far, and they said, we want to put up a mammy statue in memory of the faithful slave mammies of the South. You can see that on this prototype, mammy is written very large, and there she is with children. Just weeks before approving the mammy monument, the Senate allowed a Southern filibuster to defeat an anti-lynching bill, just so you know where the priorities were. An NAACP official said, if the South has such deep gratitude for the virtues of this devoted group from which it reaped vast riches, let it remove the numberless barriers it's gone out of its way to throw up against the progress of Blacks. They were sassy, boy, for sure. What was the Black response? What did the Black papers have to say? Oh boy, they were furious. They've newly formed civil rights groups protested in the Black press. 2,000 letters poured in from the National Association of Colored Women. Here's on the left, in the Baltimore Afro-American, Mammy as a washerwoman standing on her tub with the sign inside saying, in grateful memory to one we never paid a cent of wages during a lifetime of service. The Chicago Defender just went straight for the throat. He says, let's do a white daddy sexually assaulting a young Black woman like they did on the plantation all the time. Nothing much was getting by these guys. And 3 months later, the plan died mercifully, and there is no Mammy statue to be seen ever. At that exact same time, wouldn't you know, there's an international eugenics conference. They never stop, do they? Now, we've had to look at all the statues, so we missed a few years, just a few, and we'll go back to 1915 and see an entertainment, Birth of a Nation. Fabulous story all about the Ku Klux Klan. Shown at the White House by Woodrow Wilson, the first Southern president and a known racist. The main thing for us here is that 10 days before it opened in Atlanta, William Joseph Simmons, who was a minister that wasn't actually had a congregation, he enthusiastically took a group up Stone Mountain and burned a cross 10 days before the film opened, and restarted the KKK. Oh my gosh, talk about they never get over it. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy fell right in line. Another debacle. They had a booklet that was published by the Mississippi Division, and it was written by the division president, or published by her, and it contains, as they said, absolutely correct history of the origin of this famous Klan. She had a version that was suitable for school study, and the UGC pledged to secure its adoption as a supplementary reader in the schools and to place it in the libraries of our land. Oh my, goodness. And now we get to the end of that first big heap of activity from 1861 to 1920. The Klan has resurged, the NAACP has been founded, the Confederate memorial associations are working, and we have got monuments galore. And now we have World War I. That's all I wanted to say about that. Now, we know that Plessy v. Ferguson was in 1896, so we've got Jim Crow laws and segregation, colored waiting rooms, which certainly have seen those. I imagine folks our age that have been around the South. I only saw them when we visited the South because we didn't have this in New Mexico. I was excited about the water fountains. I was disappointed that they weren't red and blue and different colors. That's what I thought it meant. And my mother had to pull me aside. Marilynne, get over here. Don't ask. Jim Crow laws were based on the theory of white supremacy and were a reaction to Reconstruction. Separate but equal was the rule of the day, and prisons, hospitals, orphanages were segregated, as were schools and colleges. Our very own Grady Hospital was built as a segregated hospital. The H shape of it, all the cafeteria, the administration is in the bar of the H, and each side, one was to be black and one was white, but the Civil Rights Act came through before it was finished, or just as it was finishing, and it was never segregated. But all the laws were different. They were different in different communities, different states, and it was a fine line to walk. And it was a good thing if you were driving, you had the Negro Motorist Green Book to help you find food and lodging, or else you had to bring your own. Black people just got fed up with all of this. And in fact, when right after World War I, 360,000 Black men served. The country welcomed them home with 25 major race riots, and white mobs even lynched veterans in uniform. It was time to go, and they went. They started in 1915, and until 1970, 6 million African Americans relocated from the rural South to the cities of the North, Midwest, and West. At the beginning, 90% of all African Americans were living in the South, and by the time it was over, half of them were living in the North and West. Here's the pattern. The first wave started around in Georgia, in the South, of course, and it went north to New York, up to Pennsylvania, Detroit, Chicago, all these areas. And then the second wave was 1940 to 1970, and it went to the Southwest, to Northern California, up into the Pacific Northwest. This is a lovely line. We look up at the high southern sky. We scan the hot, kind black faces we have looked upon since we first saw the light of day. And though pain is in our hearts, we are leaving. No, the slowed immigration from Europe meant there was a labor shortage, so there was a reason to go north. Pullman porters on the Illinois Central, as we've heard from folk songs, the famous Illinois Central train, gave advice to Black Southerners that are heading north. But there were tensions in the North and West, very much like those in the South, except for the bright spots like the Harlem Renaissance in New York. By the 1920s, 85% of Chicago was off limits to African Americans. Redlining denied them access to mortgages to buy a home even in their own neighborhoods. But things changed. Out of turmoil and exclusion from civic life arose a political consciousness. And that's when we start seeing figures emerge, and many of them were from Southern families that were living in the North. Malcolm X was 6 when his father, a civil rights activist, was murdered. Huey Newton founded the Black Panther Party, built on the ideas of Stokely Carmichael. The Panthers espoused self-determination, quality housing, healthcare, and full employment for African Americans, not topics that were welcome in the South. Ella Baker at left worked her way up to be national director of the NAACP and worked alongside Thurgood Marshall and W.E.B. Du Bois to urge Martin Luther King to take the movement beyond Atlanta, because she wanted somebody with Southern origin so that participants wouldn't be dismissed as Northern agitators. Then in 1970, the migration reversed. Hundreds and thousands of African Americans left northern cities, but they didn't go back to the rural South. They went to the biggest cities of the South: Atlanta, Houston, Dallas, and others. Some went out to suburbs and cities like in the north and west, like, as they say, Las Vegas, Columbus, or even Ferguson. There still was white flight, police brutality, systemic ills from government policy restricting fair access to safe housing and good schools. And it ultimately ends up that the racial caste system is not just Southern, but American. But it is improving, and the more all of us understand what's involved there, maybe the faster it's going to appear. This is the new mural that's been put up downtown to John Lewis, who has been someone who was in for played the long game and made good trouble. And doggone it, they're still celebrating the Confederacy. Look at these white chicks. Monuments, so many monuments. Annual conventions, Memorial Day, flowering the graves, praising white supremacy, articles in newspapers. Oi, oi, they never quit. Here we go with the second part of the middle part of that timeline. The Great Depression, they still put up monuments, interestingly enough, but not quite as many as they did before. And after World War II, then you start to see action, civil rights action. This is the whole movement from 1955 to 1968. Brown v. Board of Education, education starts to be open to unsegregated. Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama, but it didn't do him any good. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, then sadly, the assassination of Martin Luther King. And here we are, we're up to 1970 and a little bit beyond. And what monument have we not seen yet? The biggest Confederate memorial in the world. Oh, and it belongs to us here in Georgia. How proud can you be? The original idea was for a bust of Robert E. Lee to be carved into the side of the dome. This was thought up by who else but the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They found Gutzon Borglum, and he had a great vision. He said, a bust? Are you kidding? It'll look like a stamp on the side of that thing. We need 72 figures going all across, and on the left the picture shows part of the model with the group in the front, and then the other Confederate army would be carved behind. And the UDC suggested maybe a group of hooded knights of KKK could be in there too. Well, Borglum, that wasn't what ticked him off. He was having troubles with some of the other people that were financing and this and that. And so he was dissatisfied, destroyed his models in 1926. He'd only been there for 3 years. And he left to carve Mount Rushmore. So much for that. Wipe my hands of it. They talked to Augustus Lukeman, who was willing to take over the work. He said, I've got to get rid of what's been done so far. I'll do it with 9 figures. And they said, all right. And they hired him. He wiped off everything that Borglum had done. Now, we don't know how much indeed he had done, but he did have a little bit. You can see the head of Lee up here. So not everything was taken off. And Lukeman made another profile of Lee, but he left in 1928. So there's that Stone Mountain. Nothing going on for 30 years. In 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education passed, a grand gesture needed to be made, and Governor Griffin of Georgia bought Stone Mountain for the state for $1 million in 1955 and set about finding somebody else to finish this sculpture, and he did. They found Walter Hancock, who had high-speed drills and could do it, and got it done in 10 years, although the rest of the park wasn't open until 73. It is the largest high-relief sculpture in the world and is much talked about, especially these days, when opponents discuss the merits of blowing the thing up or just cementing it over as though there's nothing there. And that's more news to follow. Here's Stone Mountain, my gosh, and here's some of the history. Over here in 1946 is a group of initiates going up Stone Mountain to burn a cross and get initiated. That, of course, stopped in 1955 when it became a monument for the state. Up here are the sons of the Confederate veterans having a rally up on top of Stone Mountain because they can. And here's just an idea for how big it is. You've surely seen it. If not, it's worth a visit. And here's a climber, and he's way up here, and you couldn't even possibly see him from the ground. So it is really quite enormous. Modern technology has helped, though, because they have laser shows on it, and you can almost pretend that it's not there. So we'll stay tuned to see what we're going to do with Stone Mountain. But mind you, it is not an ancient monument by any means, and in fact was not even a 100-year monument. 1972 was not that long ago in the scheme of things. So we're down to just the very end of what we're doing, and you can see that there are still some monuments being put up and still some schools being named, but this does not take into account the 200 statues have been taken down just in the last 2 years, and there are probably more all the time. So just to finish up, what does a statue mean? What does a statue say? Well, the maintenance of a Confederate monument may say that a city or state condones the cause for which Confederates fought. It may say that the municipality or state legislature doesn't find it problematic to enshrine those who took up arms against the U.S. government. But I think that it says that there's a glorification of white Anglo-Saxon people who've historically negated the lives of Black African-American people who share an equally Southern heritage, which I think that really looking at our shared Southern heritage is probably the best way to approach this situation. We'll go back to our beleaguered statues where we came in. Who was demonstrating? Not just Black Lives Matter protesters, but Black and white protesters who found this offensive. What is offensive? The soldiers, I think, you can make the case for these statues definitely represent white supremacy. They never believed ever that Black lives mattered a single bit. And for that reason, they should be removed from areas where people of good faith gather. Who erected the statues? The United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are becoming less relevant every year. And that's my disclaimer again, and just to remind you that I am not an expert in this. I will do my best to answer questions or comments, but anybody can do this kind of lecture, by the way, and I encourage you to do so. Do some reading up on something and volunteer. Put yourself out there and have some fun with learning. Have a seminar in your head